We're filming it?
Queer representation is a difficult thing to get right on the big screen. Too many films and TV shows, especially the last few years, contain very sanitised depictions of queer people, especially young queer people, and fail to understand the multifaceted nature of what it means to be a young queer person in 2024. In my opinion, Gregg Araki's films, namely his teen apocalypse trilogy from the 90s, do a much better job of depicting a genuine and relatable version of the queer experience that resounds just as much now as it did 30 years ago. The 1990s were a strange time to be a young film fan. Nowadays, the film landscape is so varied and niche across the board that there is something geared towards pretty much everyone. However, at the time, the sudden impact of counterculture, particularly in film, fashion and music, meant that there were two specific strands of film that targeted very different circles of young people. On one hand, the Attitude Era sex comedy films, which were particularly prominent in the late 90s and early 2000s, which were loud, heteronormative films, usually geared towards straight teenage boys, featuring crude humour, lots of male gaze-coded nudity, and oftentimes a complete disregard for the queer experience. This showed itself within these films through frequent use of homophobic slurs, and LGBTQ+ characters included solely to be fetishised, or as a punchline, or as both. There is no doubt that these films were geared towards a very specific audience. On the complete opposite side of that audience is Gregg Araki and his films, which not only targeted young people who didn't fit into this mainstream audience, but told multifaceted human stories about teens just like them. Araki arrived on the scene at a time when the new queer cinema as a movement, coined by B. Ruby Rich, had just begun to gain traction. The film of his that is most closely associated with the new queer cinema movement is The Living End, released in 1992. This film arguably established Araki's name as an unflinching and unwavering voice in the new queer cinema movement. His refusal to shy away from the reality of the two lead characters' situation, both HIV positive and embarking on a no-holds-barred crime spree, is indicative of his intention when creating his films. Rich describes Araki as the bad boy of the new queer cinema, which I believe is a moniker he earns with this film, and continues to prove himself worthy of in his teen apocalypse trilogy, where other filmmakers at the forefront of the movement, like Cheryl Dunye, Derek Jarman, and Todd Haynes, were making mature films centered around adult queer relationships. Araki sets himself apart with the teen apocalypse trilogy by centering the film's narratives around queer teenagers, using gaudy and loud aesthetics to conceal the mature themes and genuine heart that I believe is present in all three of the films that make up the trilogy. I would argue that Araki was the first to take this approach, and its impact can be clearly seen in other films of the late 90s which took a similar focus on queer teenagers, like Jamie Babbitt's But I'm a Cheerleader and Lucas Moodyson's Fucking Armor, both of which use the teen rom-com format to tell genuinely impactful stories about relationships between queer teenagers. Araki paved the way for authentic queer representation in film and TV, especially towards younger people, and nowhere is its core value of shaking up the mainstream more prominent than in the teen apocalypse trilogy. The Teen Apocalypse trilogy consists of Totally Fucked Up, released a year after The Living End in 1993, The Doomed Generation from 1995, and finally Nowhere in 1997. Each film has a standalone narrative, but they all share very similar aesthetics, themes of social alienation, loneliness, and nihilism, as well as some shared cast members, most notably James Duval, who features in all three films. I'm personally drawn to these films because I've never ever seen such an authentic portrayal of the queer experience on screen before in the way that I have with these films. LGBTQ+ representation, especially now that more and more mainstream films and TV shows feature or centre around queer characters, tends to fall into one of two extremes: extremely sanitised, bland and frictionless, or unflinchingly miserable. The latter has been present for many years now, most egregiously in the form of the bury your gaze trope that we see time and again in film and TV, most notably and often cruelly in 2000s television like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Battlestar Galactica. In recent years, in shows like Heartstopper and films like Single All the Way, Love Simon, etc., we keep seeing this utopian version of the queer experience again and again, which isn't useful or impacting to queer youth because it isn't an accurate reflection of what it's like to be a queer teenager. Gregg Araki's films, for all their visual and oral insanity, portray a multi-layered version of the queer experience that aligns with the original values of B. Ruby Rich's definition of new queer cinema as a movement, which decisively shifted modes of representation, exhibition, and reception in ways that continue to evolve today. And I believe that Araki's films, particularly the Teen Apocalypse trilogy, truly shifted the envelope on what and how queerness is presented on screen. As a young queer person watching these films 30 years after their release, despite some disappointing mainstream representation over the last 5 years particularly, it continues to be Araki's films which make me not only aware of what queer cinema can be, but why it is important to demand such a high quality portrayal of queerness on screen now more than ever. at a time that Lynn Rappaport describes new queer cinema as having evolved and devolved, where most of the great queer stories we see in film and TV are more often than not in less mainstream, independent films, with the mainstream offerings being the more sanitized, frictionless examples of queer storytelling which aren't as authentic as they could or should be. Araki describes himself as super old school, which seems counterintuitive but at the same time strangely describes a large part of his filmmaking process, to such a point that Araki was being referred to as a guerrilla goddard by the LA Weekly even before Totally Fucked Up, with the release of The Living End in 1992. Totally Fucked Up perhaps exemplifies this old school approach. The structure of the film is directly inspired by Jean-Luc Godard's Masculine Feminine, itself a film about the experiences of French youth in the 1960s. Totally Fucked Up subverts this almost slice-of-life, observational quality of Godard's film by centering the film around a group of queer teens, and taking a postmodernist approach to directly addressing what it means to be a queer teenager in the mid-1990s. The characters directly address issues like love, loneliness, dating, sex, and HIV and AIDS in interview sequences, which both were and are all realistic problems facing LGBTQ+ youth. This is already in stark contrast to portrayals of queer characters in mainstream film and TV at the time. The film avoids falling into the same tired tropes through its multifaceted portrayal of queer life, in all of its joy and misery. The characters all feel realistic, and not there solely as a means to make an audience laugh or cry. They aren't one note. They encourage and inspire the audience to relate to and empathise with the queer experience. The bold, MTV-inspired aesthetics also aid in Araki's crafting of a memorable and atypical narrative, something he would continue to utilise in an arguably greater and more insane degree with the remaining two films in the trilogy. Totally Fucked Up is arguably the most direct and unflinching portrayal of gay and lesbian lives within the trilogy, but where Araki shines with the trilogy is the continually blurry presentation of sexuality as something fluid, vague, and undefined, something that is most present in The Dune Generation and Nowhere. The Dune Generation, while billed as a heterosexual movie by Gregg Araki, still contains a varied, empathetic, and forward-thinking approach towards its depiction of sexuality and, even if characters' sexualities aren't outright stated within the narrative, maintains a degree of homoeroticism and uses even stronger post-punk and counterculture influences to subvert the classic outlaw story. A trio of misfits charged with sexual tension go on the run in a doomed odyssey across desolate Americana. On the surface, the punk influences present within the film, not to mention the soundtrack, particularly in the opening mosh pit scene set to a Nine Inch Nails song, create a loud, spiky, trashy exterior that sometimes makes audience members overlook the actual content of the film. The central trio of the film maintain a sexually charged relationship that drives the events of the film, and continues to address some of the themes present in Totally Fucked Up, namely the pairing of counterculture and queerness as causes of the ostracization of teenagers from society, the hatred and hardship they come up against when confronted by those who don't understand them, and the sexuality that they grapple with and take refuge within when things don't go well. Moran describes the journey they embark on as a desperate effort to find love and the freedom of unfettered sexual experimentation, something that I would argue is still irrefutably relevant both then and now to queer audiences. Despite the bleakness of the Dune Generation's ending, the road trip that the film's narrative centres around provides what Hart describes as a utopic space within which they can explore their most intimate desires. Despite queer theming not appearing to take central stage from the film's marketing, and particularly its tagline, The Dune Generation is another richly themed film about adolescent ennui towards a consumer culture supersaturated with sex, as Moran describes it, and affords viewers a cathartic tale spin out of this culture into a world without rules or boundaries towards sexuality and how it is defined. This premise was born from generational angst towards societal attitudes towards queer people and those on the fringes of society in the mid-90s, but I believe it still has just as much cultural relevance now towards queer audiences, in an age of sanitized queer representation. 30 years on from the release of The Dune Generation, its messy and ultimately real depiction of queerness and counterculture still feels fresh, and unlike many queer films that are releasing today. Nowhere, the last film in the trilogy, takes the backdrop of Los Angeles on the verge of the millennium to craft what Brazow refers to as a universe where nothing is permanent, where everything ends. Nowhere, in a similar fashion to Totally Fucked Up, portrays its characters' sexualities as fluid, and takes the themes of queer disillusionment from the Dune Generation to present a nihilistic view of the world at large, where the characters' only refuge is in each other in fleeting moments of connection. This sentiment is echoed in the opening line of the film, spoken by James Duval's character Dark.
LA is like nowhere. Everybody who lives here is lost.
I again think that Nowhere is a deeply moving and eternally relevant depiction of the queer experience, especially for young queer people. Much of the film, behind the candy colours and gaudy patterned textures of the set design, does come across as bleak and hopeless, in a way that I think the previous two films in the trilogy don't as much. Brazow describes the film as depicting at large the degradation of life caused by external forces, drugs, television, urban geography, alienation, which mirrors the general attitude and anxieties regarding anticipation of the year 2000. The film depicts this Y2K anxiety and bleakness as a direct juxtaposition to the brief moments of connection that we do see throughout the film, particularly in the final scene between the characters Dark and Montgomery. Dark himself is a representation of male queer loneliness, and though the scene ends with a surrealist twist that culminates in the death of Montgomery and leaves Dark alone once again, their brief connection is an emblem of queer joy and fulfillment, and a final, uniting note that echoes the film's message at large. Even if everyone is lost and everything ends, we as humans are capable of loving connection regardless of sexuality. Through all the noise of Araki's teen apocalypse trilogy, this is the driving force that makes them so relevant still, and such great pieces of queer representation. Regardless of the misery and pain in the world, we are still capable of connecting with one another, and as queer people we are no less deserving of that connection. I think that Nowhere, despite how bleak it may appear on a first viewing, is a hopeful film that continues Araki's depiction of genuine and multifaceted queer life, and while it could be interpreted as a snapshot of queer life in 1997 America, it's still relevant and just as hopeful today for queer people as it was then. Each film in Gregg Araki's teen apocalypse trilogy means a lot to me as a young queer person. Araki's MTV aesthetics and stylings in all three of these films make for eye-catching, oftentimes beautifully shot films that each belie a genuine heart, depict true and painfully relatable moments that queer viewers can empathise with, and ultimately make for some of, if not the most impactful depictions of queer lives and loves on screen that I've ever seen. Araki's guerrilla, no-holds-barred approach to queer filmmaking lives on in independent modern films, even in his own recent films, but each time I revisit his teen apocalypse trilogy, I'm reminded why they're so special to me, and why I hope to continue both seeing such heartfelt and genuine queer representation on screen, and why it's so important to me not to compromise on it when creating my own films. Araki describes Nowhere as the flip side of mainstream, a film that takes mainstream sights and sounds and queers them to create a wholly individual cinematic experience. It's important to keep this sensibility alive within cinema in order to continue crafting films that can and will resonate with the next generation of queer audience members, and hopefully allow them to feel a little less alone in a world and in a society that still, to some extent, misunderstands or at the very least overlooks and misinterprets the queer experience. Gregg Araki's films are a perfect example of real-world queerness on screen, sometimes messy, sometimes joyous, sometimes upsetting, but always hopeful.